I'm Paul Beck. I'm the chair of the steering committee for the Emeritus Academy, and I'm pleased to welcome you to what is now our third lecture in the Emeritus Academy Lecture series. We have another one in about a month. It's on December the 6th. It's Anna Soder is going to talk about poets in the hospital. So you should come and determine what it is she's talking about. It sounds very interesting conjunction of two different topics. I also want to thank the Arts and Sciences Digital Media Studio for videotaping these talks. They're going to videotape every one this year, and we will be posting those on our website so that you can queue in your million Facebook friends to come to the website and be able to be an audience for these various lectures. Well, I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Joe Donnermeyer. Joe is a professor emeritus in the School of Environmental and Natural Resources in the College of, I never get it all together, let me try it, Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences, FAES, is that what it is? Mm-hmm. He's trained as a sociologist and a criminologist and specializes in rural crime, not that he's committing rural crimes, he studies rural crimes, and also specializes in studies of the Amish community. He's editor of a Routledge series on rural criminology. He's the co-editor of the Journal of Amish and Plain Anabaptist Studies. Beyond many scholarly publications and research grants and reports to public agencies, he has won a number of teaching awards and is a member of OSU's Academy of Teaching and an author of research on teaching itself. Today, he will help us understand the Amish community, and I'm really pleased to welcome him.
Thank you very much for being here. I know it's the Buckeyes and it's not me, but nonetheless, we'll do the best we can. Look at that picture. Why is that a subculture? Shout out a few reasons why. Let's see who might get the correct answer by my judgment. What do you see? Amish. But what makes them a subculture? Uniform dress. That's a good answer, but it's not the best answer. It's one of the best. What else? Bare feet. They're walking to church on Sunday. You might say they're not in a car. But you know what it is? Because I asked my students this question. They all have hats on. But the real answer is this. The children dress like the parents. If I ask my students in any class I teach, do you dress like your parents? What's the answer? They moan, they swoon, some pass out, right? In other words, what I'm going to try to do today is get a little bit beyond the most external, visible, obvious differences. And that is a picture that is a picture of socialization. That's why it's there. But let's start with this particular thing. Now watch the numbers at the top, they change, and watch the dots. These are Amish communities in North America. Watch what happens as we get to 1970, the action really begins. And there it is today. 530 communities, the last time I counted, which was the end of October, yesterday. So it should be pretty up to date, but given the number of communities that are founded each year, by the end of this talk it may be 531. But in any case, they are increasing rapidly their population, and just to do this again, you also will notice some dots that disappear because some Amish communities do become extinct. They don't take hold. There may be a church division, they're in an unrealistic location, but whatever happens, the families do disperse and the community is no longer there. Now, an Amish community is simply defined as a cluster of families who are able to hold a church service. And in fact, most communities start out with only 3 or 4 families, but if they are to sustain themselves for 10, 15, 20 years, they will grow. So it's a very minimalist definition of what an Amish community is. Here's what it looks like in 2017. And I'll direct you to the blue text box on the left, because what has happened recently is that we have 2 new communities in Argentina and Bolivia, 2 communities in the land of Anne of Green Gables, Prince Edward Island, which can't even show up on the map. And I sat in an Amish home south of London, Ontario, about 6 weeks ago, talking to Amish who are going to start a community south of Winnipeg, and appropriately named for an audience like us, Vida, Manitoba. And so what's going to happen then is this will continue to not only increase in the number of Amish communities, 16 to 20 a year, new, maybe with 1 or 2 that go extinct, so we'll always have a nice net gain. But the other part of this is that the geographic spread is now far beyond the Midwest. And so the title of this talk is Understanding the Amish, Persistence and Change. And it is both a presentation on how well the Amish are adjusting, especially with the advent of electricity and the gas combustion engine. In other words, 117 years of successful adjustment, roughly, but also of how they use their traditions to make that adjustment. So let's keep going. Amish are a subculture. Here's a definition of a subculture, a basic sociology 101 definition of a subculture. The important point here is that subcultures are not completely separate. They're surrounded by the mainstream, and they share many similarities with the mainstream, but somehow they are distinctive. And so we can go from a biker gang to the Amish and use the same definition of a subculture. So, a sect is in essence a religious subculture. And so we can see on that PowerPoint slide 2 different kinds of sects. We see snake handlers, of which we have a few here in Ohio, grabbing those rattlesnakes and copperheads and proving they've been saved. They're very individualistic in the style of their church service. What grabs you is what you do. The Amish are also a sect, very distinctive, but they're very communal. In fact, you could argue that their goal with socialization of children is to push down the individualism that is such a marker of value in American society. I took this picture. It's a picture from the Kidron auction. My intention was to take a picture of 2 buggies that have slightly different characteristics, meaning they're from 2 different church groups and have 2 different church disciplines, that is, or autonomous, somewhat different church disciplines. Then I realized when I looked at the picture, that's a picture of what subculture is. They're surrounded by us. I'm not a biker, but I will call that a hog. Is that correct? Anyone here want to correct me on that? And on the other side is a large parking lot of automobiles. And there in the middle are the Amish, persisting and changing continuously. So if you want to visualize subculture and you want to visualize it relative to the Amish, simply keep that picture in mind. And I would invite you to travel up to Kidron, Ohio for the auctions on Thursday. You can certainly rub shoulders with a lot of people that day, many of whom are Amish, or they may be conservative, Mennonite, Beachy Amish, and related or cousin groups. So let's do a little bit of a history of what the Amish are, starting with the Anabaptist. And it goes like this. About 500 years ago, you had a Roman Catholic Church that was becoming corrupt, and we end up with a Protestant Reformation in about, 1525, 1515. It had been brewing for many, 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 many decades, but it probably really, the religion hit the fan at about that time. And then in about 1525, a group decided that the Protestant Reformation had not gone far enough, and they were called the Radical Reformation. Now, the context of this is there was a peasants' war going on in Germany and the German-speaking parts of Switzerland and in Alsace, province of what is now France. But the other part of it is that the people who decided to openly baptize themselves as adults were college educated and lived in the city of Zurich. And they are actually the start of what is now a group that is rural and only goes up to the 8th grade with her education, which is rather ironic. Now, why would rebaptizing yourself as an adult be considered radical? Well, at that time, baptism rolls, infant baptism, both adhered to by Lutherans and by Catholics, were used as rolls for taxation and rolls to conscript young men into the military. So by openly declaring that infant baptism is not legitimate, you have just told government, whether it's large or small, that they have no business in religious decisions. That was radical 500 years ago. Almost immediately, persecution began. The 4 college-educated men who started this Anabaptist movement, 3 of them were killed, either burned at the stake or dipped in oil, some horrific martyrdom within 3 years. And the 4th one did not, only because he died of the bubonic plague while waiting to be executed. And so from there, however, the movement spread. And it spread mostly up either side of the Rhine River. And so that's how this Anabaptist movement began. So the action was all in that area, Hesse province, German-speaking areas of Switzerland, Alsace area. That's where the action was when this early movement began. Now, if you are an Anabaptist, what are you going to do for worship? You're going to go out into the woods and have a secret service. You're not going to build a church building with a big sign that says Anabaptist Church, First Street Anabaptist Church, because it's not going to work. And so that's what they began to do. Because they were being so persecuted, they did begin to grab onto biblical quotes that emphasize separation from the world. And so St. Paul, especially his letters to the Romans and the Corinthians, were important for that, of not being yoked to the world in some form. And that philosophy continues today, of course, for the Amish. Now, let's continue this. We can put in a fellow named Menno Simons, a former Catholic priest, because he could read and write, who started writing down what it meant to be Anabaptist. And before you know it, a lot of these Anabaptists, especially in Northern Europe, were nicknamed Mennonite. And that's where that phrase comes from. And roughly speaking, that was the 5-second history of a very long group. And then we can go a little bit further. Things settled down. The Anabaptists managed to eke out livings. They spread over into the Alsace region, but about 1693, there's a schism, a division. And one of the things that happened was that Jacob Ammon was a leader of the conservative group that split with the Mennonites or Swiss Brother. And now you know where the word Amish comes from. That's the nickname. Now, I will tell you this story. Actually had someone raise their hand and object to a Christian group being named after a human, and in the same sentence they said they were Lutheran. And about 3 seconds later they realized what they said. So I had no need to respond to them, okay, in a way. So William Penn is looking to occupy Pennsylvania, in part because he owned a lot of land and he could make some money. He was not his family had been in debt, and so he was trying to attract groups over. He wrote very glowing reports about Pennsylvania. Not only attracted Quakers, but it also attracted a lot of other religious minorities, including Amish and Mennonites. And so by 1730 or so, the first Amish were arriving. Of course, they're going through the port of Philadelphia and up to Lancaster County, Berks County, in that area of Pennsylvania, and so that's their origins. But the funny thing happens is that by the 1860s, the Amish had spread all the way as far west as Iowa. The first settlement in Ohio was 1808, the Greater Holmes County community, which today is the largest. And in essence, then, you can think of the Northwest Territories getting converted into states, and then the Amish were soon there. And then, so by the Civil War, they were out to Iowa, but the later groups that arrived did not necessarily go through the port of Philadelphia, and so there were some differences between the more progressive Amish of the West and the more conservative Amish of the East, including most of those in Ohio. And so during the Civil War, as we were going through a North-South division, they were going through an East-West division. And about 2/3 of the Amish subsequently decided they didn't want to be conservative. And they not only realized they could not reconcile, but most of those churches drifted into various conservative Mennonite denominations and often dropped the word Amish from the name of their church. And so by 1900, the Amish population actually had declined by over half. But we get to 1900, and we're beginning to use these things, electricity, and we're beginning to travel by automobile. And that had the unintended consequence of creating a division between us and them that helped them grow. So what happens then is, to put all that back up again, since 1900, most of the divisions within the Amish, by the way, religions are very, very good at splitting, schisms, divisions, branches. And I would think sometimes with the Amish, we ought to call it twigging, not even branching. And so since 1900, most of the divisions have been internal. Everyone still identifies Amish. Everyone still maintains you're not allowed to own a car. And so that technological divide has not been jumped. And today we have a series of conservative Amish groups that go by various names, usually the name of one of the leaders, Schwarzentrooper, Byler, on and on like that. And they make up approximately 12% of all Amish. There are about 330,000 Amish today. There's also a more progressive Old Order group with about 3%. They're called New Order Amish. And so when you take 12 plus 3, what's in the middle is the Old Order Amish, are about 85%. And they would be considered the mainstream group within the circle of Amish. But we do have a lot of variety in Amish today. And as you begin to do research on them, especially when I'm doing on demographic research, fertility, etc., we need to know where these differences are. So basically, from Europe to the United States, and they just start growing as our lifestyles change increasingly and increasingly and increasingly. And so we get up to the present time with about 530 communities. And now 2015 would only be showing slightly over 500. And we'll get these maps updated eventually. You may not know this, but there's a census every 10 years of denominational membership by county in the United States. And we're going to be updating this because I'm the one who's going to do the Amish census. Count the bonnets and the straw hats and see what we come up with. So here's Ohio with some rather famous communities, such as right there, the Beard Cutters, Bergholz. They are not considered an Amish community. They're called Renegade Amish. And in fact, somebody wrote, rather tongue-in-cheek, instead of being Old Order Amish, they're Out of Order Amish. Okay. This one is distinctive because it lasted over 100 years, but is finally to the point where we declared, in myself and my co-author, who happens to be Amish, declared that it was extinct in 2012 because they could no longer hold a church service. So there may be a Der Dutchman restaurant out there, but and there are remnants of Amish and people who were former Amish, and I think there's 3 elderly women who rent a van and drive somewhere else for a church service. And so that one has declined. Yet we have some new ones. Barlow, which is actually near one that went extinct, Junction City, you can see a couple up here, and this one right here, Mount Vernon, started October 1st, 2017. What happened? There's a fairly conservative group right here, Hardin, Kenton, Ohio, Hardin County. However, some of the men have very successful businesses. And they're beginning to use technologies that the community in general don't think they should use. Lots of discussion, lots of disagreement, no resolution, and approximately 40 of the 300 families there have decided it would be better if they start a new community and move. And so the first families have moved over there from Kenton to land that they bought in Mount Vernon, where they can still be Amish, but be a bit more progressive in terms of the technology they use. And most of it centers around the use of a computer and a monitor in some form. So that's what happens. So that one's quite significant. You can also see that Ohio is surrounded by some of the largest communities. The third largest is right there. Obviously, we have the largest, and there's the fourth largest, and way over there by that window is Lancaster County. And you can see some other fairly large ones. This is the fifth largest, Bern, Monroe, Geneva. So this is an area that we not only have more Amish in Pennsylvania, we just beat them in football anyway, so we might as well brag a little bit more. But the other point is that we have about 1,000 more Amish estimated than they do. There are about 67,000. They have 58 communities. We have 60 communities with about 68,000. The other thing I'll point out is right here, Holmes County. You see the greater Holmes County community takes in parts of 5 other counties. Holmes County itself is a relatively rural county. If we estimated the proportion of that population that drives a buggy for church on Sunday, it's close to 43% today. The most Amish county anywhere. And if the fertility rate doesn't go down, they likely will be the first majority Amish county anywhere in North America at any time in the history of North America. It might take another 20 years, but it's going to happen at the current rate. Now, what I'm going to do is, now that we have the history done, I'm going to go into 2 things, and it's going to be quite fast. Take notes. There'll be an exam later, right? And it will be first the outward characteristics, those things that you're more likely to see from a tour bus. Then we're going to get to things that are more inward, although they're all related to each other. So that this is a very artificial division on my part. We'll start with the most obvious. They're rural located. By the way, the area up in Holmes County is probably one of the most densely populated rural areas anywhere in Ohio, with 150-acre farms, etc. Truly, the ecology of that area the human ecology of that area is distinctive from other rural areas where there's been population loss and consolidation of farms. All Anabaptist groups, which include the Hutterites, I don't know if you know this, they're a cousin group. They grew out of the Anabaptist movement that was along the Danube River rather than the Rhine River. And Mennonites and others, that German Baptist, they're all rural located. There's only one Anabaptist group, and they're actually a development out of World War I in Germany called Bruderhof that has a colony, 2 colonies in 2 large cities, one of them being Sydney, Australia. So they have decided to move into the city. Otherwise, none of these Anabaptist groups can really survive without having a rural location. And it is true in rural America that so many of our groups that are distinctive rural subcultures, a sect, or cults, locate in rural areas where they can be by themselves. Second, plain clothes. We know that. Now, you can sometimes tell whether Amish are more or less progressive by the brightness of the clothes and all of that. So these are markers of distinction that the Amish are different from us, but also it rather marks, you can begin to tell what community a fellow Amish person is from by what they're wearing. Now, we may not know all of the minutiae of clothing, but certainly if you grow up in that community, you will know it. Number 3 on this list, horse and buggy for travel and field work. And you might think that all buggies look the same, but in fact, different communities have different traditions on the color of a buggy. In fact, that yellow buggy down there is one of the most conservative Amish groups. But it represents the fabric that was used for buggies back when that community began. And so they maintain that as an identifier for their particular community. Now, in case you need to know, those buggies look like the kind of buggies we drove in the 1800s. Those are called jennies. Apparently they're named for a rather famous opera singer from Sweden. They got named for her. She must have been, in the 1800s, the Lady Gaga of her time. And as a result, they're called jennies, but they look rather like Amish buggies in style. So we changed. They did not. Pennsylvania Dutch language. Now, here's the important thing about Pennsylvania Dutch. It is a German language. That word Dutch actually signifies German languages as the waves of German immigrants came over in the 1700s. I just reviewed a book, a very good book by Mark Loudon, who wrote Pennsylvania Dutch, an American language. That's an intriguing title. And he hit it when he said in a sentence, "This is an American language assembled from German parts." And he is correct. And I would say that the Amish are exactly that. They are a European sect, but assembled in America. That's where their real history has been. They're more agricultural than us. We're down, actually, I'm a little bit off. It's 1.4% of us live on a farm. I got 1.5%. About 17% of Amish men farm today. Did you know it's that low? But it's still 8 times higher. Now, back in about 1965, from what I can estimate, 70% of men made a living from farming, but today they do all kinds of other things, from welding to anything having to do with wood in its various forms, masonry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're very good entrepreneurs. And so there's been this shift out of agriculture. Now, what's significant about that, if you know anything about demography, is there isn't a society in the world that has shifted from agricultural to industrial that did not have a decline in fertility, except the Amish. They have barely had a decline in fertility. It has not changed, and that is extremely significant for more of the quantitative research that I'm involved with. And will this begin to change as we move into this 21st century? Because it will affect population growth and the continued diffusion of communities throughout North America. Number 6 on this list is they have a church discipline called an ordnung or utning. And it encodes the practices based upon those fundamental beliefs about being separate from the world. Now, all of those pictures are attempts to show various kinds of technology that are in fact workarounds. I often have people believe Amish don't use electricity, and I go, heaven forbid, they do. It's called a battery. And so we have, in fact, I read an article that claimed that 80% of Amish in Holmes County have solar panels. It's self-standing. Once you get it, you can charge a battery. So go forth and buy solar panels. Turn signals on buggies, cell phones, there's more solar panels, telephone booths in case you're conservative enough that you can't have a cell phone yet. There's a reading lamp, propane, almost like an IV pole at a hospital. You roll it around. And on and on. Down in West Union, Ohio, they're not allowed to have bicycles, so they have these hybrid scooter bicycles. Why don't they have bicycles? Well, you can travel too far. It reduces community cohesion. So that's what they do. Okay, so we got that. And number 7 on this list is that their church groups have about 25 people. Now we're beginning to make a small transition into inward. And so what's remarkable about the Amish is that they keep their church groups small, about 25. They get over 35 families, they'll split in 2. And so what is nice about that is with a church service every 2 weeks, you can pretty much get to everyone's household that year because church is held from residence to residence. Usually in a barn, if the group is too large for the house or it's in the house, you separate men from women. So if we had an Amish church service here, women would be on one side, men on the other. And that's how those things are set up. Their church services last about 3.5 hours, followed by a fellowship meal. And it's nice to go to those because if you're a guest and you're my age, you could serve first. Isn't that nice? And the kids got to serve you too. It's really nice. However, for confession and some other kneeling activities in their church service, if you're my age, you have to consult your chiropractor by the end of the day. It gets to be onerous physically for someone like me, especially when you have to bend over a bench and put your face on the ground on the other side during confession. It's a challenge to the spinal cord. Okay, so they have no church building, and they rotate the church services from residence to residence. This has two really primary functions that are sociological. And the first one is this: it compels families to cluster geographically. So when I showed you those maps of new communities starting, it wasn't an individual moving. It was a cluster of families moving to the same place. That means they're coordinating their moving plans and their purchase of real estate in advance. And of course, then, it compels the development of a new community to include enough families living close together. Hence, when you get up to 3, 4, 5 families and they're able to bring a van load in from a nearby community and have a church service, that's when that definition of a community that I use says they have begun. Now, will they sustain themselves over the long haul? So this is really quite functional, a horse and buggy culture, for maintaining that cohesion that is necessary to be separate from the world. At the same time, you're trying to make a living in the world. Number 8, and the final one on the outward side, by the way, that is a picture of a bench wagon. You know where the Amish church service is going to be because that wagon gets delivered to the residents several days before, so they can set up the benches in the barn or in other places or in the house. And so if you're in an Amish area, you know who's going to have the church service that Sunday. And so right now there are about 2,300 church groups located in slightly more than 500. You see, I've already fudged. 530 communities in 31 U.S. states, 3 Canadian provinces, and by April it will be 4 Canadian provinces with Manitoba. And who knows, maybe they're talking about going back to Mexico, where they tried and failed to have a settlement. So you never know. They use a lot of medical services down in Mexico, so it is possible they will begin to move down there. So what we have then is this amazing map with all of the blue stars representing my attempt to locate new communities. They're roughly correct, but you know how pixels are on PowerPoint, so they're pretty close. And we have them as far south as Sarasota, Florida. The city actually grew up around that Amish community. It is the only non-buggy driving community. They use 3-wheel bicycles. All the way up to Rexford, Montana. Look at that. We have 4 of them in Colorado, Salmon, Idaho, Hewlett, Wyoming, of all things near Devil's Tower. But it is one of the few counties in Wyoming that has, I think, for gardening is a zone 5. And that becomes important for economic production in the household. And all the way up now into Ontario, even on Manitoulin Island, if I pronounced it correctly, which is the largest island in the world for an inland lake. And of course, Prince Edward Island, which we can't possibly squeeze on this PowerPoint. So we have that. So we'll keep number 8 up there and go to the inward. No church hierarchy. Each church has its own bishop, usually 2 ministers and a deacon. There is no pope, there is no cardinal, there is no vicar, no vertical organization to the Amish. 2,300 plus autonomous church groups. Leaders of each group are selected and nominated by lottery. There's no training. You simply follow Acts of the Apostles. How did Matthias get selected after Judas had to be replaced? You drew lots. And so Amish men are nominated. They leave the room. 3 men might be nominated. You put that biblical passage, write it on a piece of paper inside one of the Bibles, shuffle the Bibles. They come back in, and it's the will of God who is becomes the leader. Okay? Now, they have an otning or a church discipline, and before they have communion twice a year, they review that church discipline. Are they going to change it? Are they going to allow propane-run refrigerators? Will they allow the men to have computers that might be linked to the web, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all this minutia. So you see the word engineering there, and I mean it. Some of you are engineers in this room. This is a self-consciously engineered subculture. If you review your practices twice a year, you have engineered yourself. And you are self-aware of your boundaries to a degree that we in the mainstream are not. And that's why I have that one up there. And here's the thing, and we're going to begin to conclude with this. Baptism is adulthood, late teens, early 20s, and it is now, it's a vow, it's a symbol of obedience to God and humility to your church group. It's called Gelationheit in Pennsylvania Dutch. And here is what is really causing the Amish population boom. It is that the rate of retention of young people today, a marker of socialization that is successful, is now 90%. And before 1900, it was likely below 50%, although it's hard to come by firm statistics on that. So what's happening? Here's the baby boom. Here's the population boom, of the Amish. Rapid growth every 20.5 years. I calculated that as the doubling time. And what's happened is we got pretty much maintaining large families. Number of children has declined only slightly over the years. But we have gone from less than 50% of a retention rate up to 90%. And that is what has caused this population boom in the 20th century and now into the 21st century. So what's going on? What's happening? And it's very simple. Dense social networks. But what do I mean by that? Here's what I mean. That's us. That's you. That's me. We love what we do, don't we? I have lots of friends, lots of people I talk to. But my world is segmented. The people that I work with are not the people who live in my neighborhood. Yeah, there's a retired chemistry professor. That's about it. The people that are my family, they don't work at Ohio State. I know we have some exceptions to that, and they don't live in my neighborhood. Oh, thank goodness for the in-laws, right? Okay, but see how segmented we are? We got all these groups, but they're not connected to each other. And we can say that for church, we can say that for school, we can say that for sports. But the Amish, they look like this. Well, they're supposed to look like something, but we're going to have to advance it over here. They look like that. When you're Amish, the person that you work with, your kids may go to the same school, and you may be related, and you may be neighbors all at the same time. All of these statuses that you have are interconnected and interrelated. That's dense social networking. Let's see if this thing is working. Meanwhile, if you go back to 1890, guess what? We had the same lifestyles. And we had the same technology. If we had to read a book at night, we had a kerosene lamp. If we had to go shopping in town, we had a horse and buggy. And so it was easy back in 1890 for a young Amish man or woman to decide, maybe Amish life isn't for me, and I'm kind of got my eye on this very nice looking person who's Presbyterian. And what do? I simply slide over to a different Christian denomination. Today, that distance is much larger for the Amish. That is what has happened in all of this. So the battery may be going on the slide advance because it's working intermittently. So we'll go to this. What is the future of the Amish? Well, if I start with my base numbers and simply assume that the increase will continue at its current rate, I get numbers like this by 2050. Over 1,000 communities and nearly 1 million Amish. They'll actually be a significant share of our rural population. So what are the consequences of something like that? Well, one is, with greater numbers comes more geographic spread of their communities, and therefore of the various church districts that define their ordnung autonomously without a church hierarchy. And so this diversity of ordnung will mean that as long as they stay within the boundaries of horse and buggy, they will be counted as Amish. In other words, we'll have more diversity of Amish, and of course, as a result of that, we will also have more divisions, schisms, branches, and twigs that define who the Amish are. There'll be great diversity within the Amish, where the most conservative Amish may look at the most progressive Amish and wonder how they can call themselves Amish, and also the other way as well. That's what's going to happen. So the bottom line on the Amish is this. The Amish are modern sectarians. They use their traditions, their heritage, their history, and that unique decision-making of reviewing their church discipline twice a year to make the adjustments necessary to live in our kind of society, surrounded by us. So let's call them modern sectarians. They still don't want to be unequally yoked to the world. That's where they are, and that's why I'm going to spend a great deal of my retirement having the fun of doing this kind of research. Thank you. We have about 5 minutes? Okay, so let's start questions, please. I saw your hand go up first, and then we'll go to you, sir. Okay? No, that's a very good question. There are some Mennonite denominations that can trace their heritage back to the original Anabaptist movement. But Amish completely transplanted over here. The last Amish people who identified themselves as Amish died out in the early 1900s. There were still some remnants, but their presence was pretty much significantly in North America even by 1800. Yes, sir.
Coincidentally, not related to your talk, on Monday I was in Berlin, and I went to Orm's hardware store because my wife wanted to buy a pitchfork, and this was not a place generally where tourists would go, but there was an Amish gentleman there, clothed totally in black. And I immediately started speaking to him in German, Hochdeutsch.
And he could understand you?
Yes, he could understand me, and the conversation went along reasonably well. Certain times there were lapses.
Yes.
But I did ask him, well, what language do you speak at home? And the answer that I got from him was German.
German.
Now, in your studies of the Amish people, is that generally true or not?
Yes, it is true. They obviously would more likely, there are a lot of different names for what Pennsylvania Dutch is and a lot of different accents on Pennsylvania Dutch. I actually have a book called How to Speak Amish, and when I played the CD for a husband and wife near Elmer, Ontario, which is a community directly north of here, they said, oh yeah, that's good Pennsylvania Dutch, but that word and that word, we pronounce it differently. We use this, and so there are a lot of varieties on the Pennsylvania Dutch language. So I'm not surprised he just called it German as a result of your interaction with him. Now,
He did use the word Pennsylvania Dutch.
he did too, okay. Now, one thing about Pennsylvania Dutch, is that if you do read the history of Pennsylvania Dutch, it was a dialect that was spoken by German immigrants primarily in Pennsylvania. It was not sectarian. It was not associated with religious identification. But as the other Germans assimilated into American society, they dropped using Pennsylvania Dutch. And today we identify it with the Amish. And so it really isn't a religious identifier per se, although we certainly know that it divides the mainstream from the Amish today. So, great question. Yes, sir?
Religious services, are they in English or
German.
German?
And scriptures are read in High German. Yes.
Could you say a little bit about the economics of the Amish farms, the time when farms are being, consolidated into large
Yeah, I can make a couple observations on that. A lot of Amish have gone into organic. Oh, okay. What he was talking about was the economics of farming for the Amish today. Okay, and I'll make two comments. One, if you're in the older communities, you're using your land more intensively, such as intensive grazing, or for greater values, such as organic farming. One of the things that is spurring the development of Amish in other communities is the differential in price per acre. So for instance, the group near London, Ontario, is moving out to Manitoba because near London, farmland is $25,000 an acre. Near Manitoba is $3,500 an acre. Now, how did that happen? Well, Ontario shut down tobacco farming through a heavy tax on drying the tobacco. That used to be a tobacco area 15 years ago. As a result, a number of the English farmers that have large feedlots were buying up all the land, and the price has gone so sky high that this Amish community looks at having 25 teenagers, kids coming out of the 8th grade, who are gonna have to start a family, and they value farming. And where are they going to go? They can't afford land there anymore. We're going to start a sister community, and we're going to go all the way out to Manitoba, where we know the soil isn't as good, but the price can't be beat. Okay, two more questions. So all the way in the back, and then we'll go all the way to the front. Say it again. I can't hear you. Oh, okay, Amish restrictions on travel. Let's make it like that. No problem at all. They rent vans. You'll find Amish coming down here to the OSU Medical Center out of various parts of Ohio, and what they have is they have what's called an Amish Taxi, and it's usually a van that looks like a church van, and the driver has on a ballpark cap, and everybody else has on a straw hat and a bonnet. Okay, the Amish will, if you take Amtrak, you're likely to run into Amish families. They'll travel by train or by bus. There is a more progressive Amish group that will also travel by plane. And so they get to visit some of the historical sites over in Europe, and their bishops are the ones supervising the two communities in South America because they are able to fly down there. So no, there's no real restriction. It's the ownership of the car. There are some conservative Amish that will say, we want to hold back on you renting a van or traveling with someone who's not Amish unless it's very important. It can't be frivolous. So as you go across the variety of Amish, they're self-conscious about that issue and what its repercussions are for the social fabric of Amish society. Final question. Go ahead.
Given the small communities, is there an issue with marriage?
Given the small communities, is there an issue with marriage? First of all, there are two things associated with the Amish that are no longer true and probably weren't true very much at an earlier time. One is first cousin marriage, which actually was a pretty prevalent colonial practice, and the other is bundling, bed courtship, which was also more back in colonial times. Only a few Amish bundle today, and so the answer is that their marriages are endogamous, that is, you marry inside the Amish faith, but there's a great deal of variety, and first cousin marriage hasn't really been part of the Amish lifestyle for 150 years. Now, they do have what one would say is a more shallow gene pool, and that's why they're of interest for cancer research. Because most everyone can trace their ancestry back to a relatively small group of immigrants. And so there can be recessive genes that become prominent and that have something to do with calculating rates of cancer. I'll also mention one other thing on this that relates to the research I do, and that is the Amish publish directories of themselves where they mention the birth date of the husband and the wife and when the husband and wife got married and the birth dates of all of the children and their baptism status if they're adults. If they're no longer Amish or if they are Amish, and if they are Amish, where did they move? And so there's a lot of good data for a sociologist there. And it occurred to me, since I'm also a criminologist, that there's a measure of deviance in that data. And the measure of deviance is that what is the distance in time between the marriage and the firstborn? I used the 6-month figure, I believe. That seemed like a pretty good arbitrary, that they weren't paying attention to their church rules, and there was a premarital conception, and it was something like 8%, which is far, far, far below the average for American society. So we do know there's some shenanigans going on during courtship, but it's relatively under control, and that all of those folks got married, and they're listed in the directory unabashedly with the birth date of the first child. And so it shows how tight-knit everything is and how successful the socialization is, even when there are some deviations in the culture. So great questions. I wish my students would ask questions this good. Thank you again very much. A good attentive audience.